In this example, we are going to be creating a web app, a standalone web application that's going to output data from an object coming from the server side, send it over to the client side where we can retrieve it and add it into a JavaScript object, which that then can be used within the code in order to update the web page elements. As well, we're going to be adding input fields and a button, so we can make an AJAX request sending data from the client side as an object and sending it to a function on the server side, which then can use that information within the function and update a spreadsheet with the new data and provide a response back of the row that was updated, which then gets output to the user. So trying out the application, we'll send the name of John Svekis over to the spreadsheet. That gets added into row 13, and we get a response back from the server as to what row it got added. So adding in users to the spreadsheet from the client side and then retrieving back some information is what we're going to be covering in this lesson. Go over to script.google.com. We're going to create a brand new standalone web application, and this is going to be serving up the client side versus the server side code, and this is just a test application. So give it a name, and the first function that we're going to be setting up is the default doGet function, which is going to allow us to launch the web application. Also, under the Files tab, create a new HTML file, and we can just give this one a name of index. So this will be our HTML file that we're going to be using within the web app that we're going to be serving up to the users and connecting to the Google Apps script from the client side. So it's going to be a client side web application running within the web app URL. So create an object, and this is just a temporary object so that we can show you how the content can be sent from the server side over to the client side. And we'll comma separate this out. ID. So we've got some data here. I'm going to update both of these to be the single quotes, as these are just string values. So using our web application, let's create HTML content with the HTML service. We're going to create a template from a file. The file that we're using is going to be the index file that we just created. And that's going to be just generating out the content from the index file into the web page. We want to also pass into this HTML object, and using a variable object property name of data, let's send over some data into this application. So this can also be an object, and we'll set the status as ready, and then the data within the data object, and that's going to be coming from the my object data. And that's from this object that we've just created. So what this is going to do is this is going to pass the content into the web application, that content object. And lastly, we just need to do a return and take the HTML object and evaluate it in order to render out the content. So in order to get the data, there's a number of ways that we can do it with the scriptlet. And one of the best ways that I find is just to bring it all in as JavaScript code, and that way you can just utilize it as JavaScript. So in the top of the application, let's set up the script tags, and this will bring the object data in from the Google script side so that we can use it within our client-side code. So I'm going to create an object called data, and then using the scriptlet. And in order to render out the contents from the scriptlet, we got to use the exclamation mark and the equal sign. And this is JSON stringify of the data object that we're sending in from the server side. So using the scriptlet, this is going to load all of the data that we're sending through to the object into the scriptlet, and now it's going to be ready to use within the client-side code of the JavaScript. And this is just going to run just as we would with regular JavaScript. So where if we created an H1 tag on the page, and then let's add in another script tag, and this is just regular JavaScript code where we'll select the H1 element using the document object and then query selector to select the element with the H1 tag. And then we'll populate the content into the H1, and we've got all of this information sitting within the data. So within the data object, so let's update the text content of the H1 tag. And under the data, so the data is now within the JavaScript object. And we should be able to retrieve back the first name this way. So that should update the content of the H1 with the data that's coming from the server-side web application object. So next, let's deploy the web application, and we'll try out the function. So setting up a new deployment, select the type as a web app. I'll just call it new web app, and we can set it to anyone can access it. Open up the web app URL. So open up the web app URL, and because this is now in the browser, we can select inspect, and under inspect we've got a console value. So we see that the problem here is that data is not defined. So let's update the application. And this is typically going to be something on the front end code where we might have an error with the JavaScript. So we'll comment out the H1 text content, and then we'll also comment out the other object. So we are passing in this as an object, and it's called data. And it looks like we need to end the JavaScript code with the semicolon. So let's try that again, and we'll try it within the developer version. So under the test developments, and going into the code inspector. Now we do have the data object, and we're able to see the data content. Let's uncomment the script contents. Go back into the developer version. Do a refresh of the page content. And as we now see that it's loading within the JavaScript object, we can use the JavaScript code in order to output the content on the page. And there we've got the value, and this is the value coming from the first name here. And I'll just update those. And if we update the object data, that's also going to update the output content. So going back into the client side, let's create an input, and this can be type text, and we'll set a default value of it. And then also add in a button, and we'll call it add to sheet. So what this button will do is this is going to send the request to the Google Apps script, running a function passing in data from the input field, and then we can update the spreadsheet with this value. And we'll give it a name of first, and we'll set a second one for last, so that it corresponds with what we have for the spreadsheet content that we're going to be updating and adding to. So give this one a name for last, and then we need to select this using JavaScript. And let's just see that it's working within the developer. And let's connect those element objects with the JavaScript code, where we'll select the values. So select the button using the document and query selector. Select the element with the button, and it's going to add an event listener to there. And then select the page elements, the input elements. So we can use the query selector and selecting the input, and with the attribute property of name is going to be first. So select that object, and then also we'll select the other element into another property called myLast, and that's going to select that input element from the page. So this is regular front-end code, JavaScript code. Let's take the button and add an event listener. So we have the same options that we have with regular JavaScript where we can run the code and we can make something happen using the client-side code. Within the web app, we can use the google.script.run function and run some code that we've got on the server side. And this just requires the function that we want to run. And we'll run the function called test fun. So on the Google script side of it, we'll create the function called test fun. And for this, we can run some code. So maybe we want to output into the logger and try that out to see if that works. We'll refresh the page. So we can run any server side function. And this is the function call that we see that's being output here. If we go to the execution, so we're not able to see the log information. So let's directly update to the spreadsheet every time that's pressed. So selecting the spreadsheet by its ID, go over to the spreadsheet that you want to use. And we'll set up the spreadsheet ID. And we'll create a function add to sheet. And then whatever data that we want to add to the spreadsheet. And this can be an array that we can just append to the spreadsheet as a row. So selecting the ID of the spreadsheet that we want to use. And we don't need the slash for the ID. And now let's select the sheet object. So using the spreadsheet app class, we can open by ID. And we've got the ID value for the sheet. And then get sheet by name. And let's select the spreadsheet that we want to update. And in this case, I believe it's sheet number 2. So whatever the name is of the sheet that you want to interact with. So that's going to select it within the sheet object. And then now within the sheet, we can append a row, and that row can be coming from the data. So every time the button gets pressed, instead of logging out to the log, we'll append to the sheet. And we'll construct an array of some values. So we'll have a name of Jane Smith, and that's going to be sent over to the add to sheet. And now whenever we run the add to sheet, we need to do a refresh on there. And it requires the authorization, that's why we're throwing the error. So let's first run the test function within the web app and accept the permissions to authorize the web app to interact with the Google Sheet data. And I'll just go through and allow that. And go over to the sheet. So there's that new value that's been added. Let's try another name there. And now we'll refresh the web app. And when we click add to sheet, that should be adding that new name to the sheet whenever it's pressed. So whenever it finishes doing the run, it's just adding it to the next available row. So let's remove that, and we'll try that one more time. So it should now be adding it to the next available row, and then we need to drag down in order to have the function that's making the calculation from the string names. So we don't necessarily need that because we just want to be able to add new users to the row of contents. So let's update this a little bit further, where when we're pressing the button, we're going to run the function, and this function is going to send the values over from the input fields. And we can set those back up here where we can select the value of first and last. And I'm going to create that within an object. So it's just a temporary object. And this makes it a little bit easier to send the data over to the server side. So we've got our first name, and that's coming from the value of the input. So whatever the first name is. And then last, and this is going to be coming from the value of my last value. And now let's send it over, temp, and we'll still send it over. We'll keep the same test function name. And now we're going to be picking up a first and a last. So we're picking up the object And this could be like a user or something like that. So this is within an object format. So sending the data, we can do a first and then a user last, and see if we can send over the information from the spreadsheet, or to the spreadsheet from the client side. So I'm just going to add a 1 there. Go over to the spreadsheet. So we're able to update the spreadsheet with the client side code. We can also return content back. So adding in on with success handler. So that gives us an opportunity on the client side to do something with the response content that's come back. So this is just adding in or chaining together the with success handler function, and then whatever we want as the success function. So this function is going to run on the client side whenever the code completes, and we can pick up the response value on the client side. So let's set up the success function, and it's probably better to call it on success. So on success. And then this is going to get the response value. And for now, we can just add the response value into the sheet. So go back to the Google script. And whenever we're appending the data, we want to get the row of the data that we've appended. So let's return when we add to the sheet. From the sheet object, get last row value, and that will return a numeric value for the last row. And so this can then retrieve back a row value, which we can then return back to the user. So now let's try this another time, and we'll just call it John Svekis. So this time we should see the row value, so we get a value of 10, and that's going to correspond with the row from the sheet. So we're able to send and retrieve a response back from the web application as we send the values over to the function on the server side. And you can create fairly flexible applications this way. So we can also create a div, and I'll give it a class of output so that we'll select it with the JavaScript code. And then we'll select that element and we'll just output the result value there so that the user can see the entire contents on the page. So selecting the document, query selector, select the element with a class of output, and then let's add the text content of this, and I'll just create a variable called HTML, which will use in order to construct the output content. So item added to row, and then what we've got within the response object. So we just output that back to the user on the page. So do a refresh, and we can clear. So now we can visually see when we add to the sheet, we see that item added to row 11 when it completes. So whenever that item is added to row 11, that's going to run the script and complete the process. So go ahead and try it out for yourself and send over some data from your server side to the client side. And then also from the client side, get input values using JavaScript and send that over to the server side to update a spreadsheet with new data, and that's coming from the web app. So go ahead and try it out. And once you've completed, you can just set this up as a deployment. I'm going to deploy it as an executable application. And now we can run it within the executable and add content to the spreadsheet, and it will return back the row that the content was added to.